comes to pass, there are entire swaths that many of us, myself included, were completely ignorant of. And so I'm really happy to have Adrienne here to join us. I don't want to take any of her time, so I'm going to hand over the presentation to her, and I will facilitate the question and answer afterwards. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. And sorry I couldn't be in person, though I realize Phil and we could have organized something because we're so close, where we could have at least presented in the same room. But this works. Now, Nick already sort of introduced it because I think that we were both, you might ask yourself why I, as a person who doesn't work on Hispanic or Latin American gaming, is closing out this amazing and what feels very much like a historic conference, which is fair. I asked Nick the same question. And part of the answer is a logistical one. I was supposed to present this morning, but Jose and I traded. But more specifically, Nick thought, and now having seen the last 2 days worth of presentations, I agree that there are some useful and interesting overlaps between the work I've been doing over the last 7 years through the LGBTQ Game Archive and then later Rainbow Arcade, and the work that has been and might be done on Hispanic and Latin American game history and research. And while I didn't plan on unboxing like Phil did, I hope that this talk unboxes the LGBTQ Game Archive and Rainbow Arcade projects for people looking to do similar work. And I apologize, that will not be my last cheesy joke. All right, so I used to start these talks by answering the question I got nearly every time I talked about LGBTQ games for the first decade or so of my academic career, which is there LGBTQ content in games? And the answer is obviously yes. As time has gone on, I find that people are less surprised by that fact, but I do still see a lot of people talking about this content as somehow new. And one of the impetuses behind this project, and then later Rainbow Arcade, was demonstrating that this content isn't new. It has a long history in games. We just don't have a very good accounting of it, at least not when I started the project. Although we do have some histories of gender and sexuality in games, both of these books coming from game designers, these histories have tended to focus on gender as only meaning cisgendered women and sex as largely in terms of heterosexuality. There hadn't been a systemic analysis of LGBTQ representation over time, though those do exist for other media, particularly film and television, print journalism, and advertising. And gaming history is a growing area of academic research. And increasingly, as we've had a wonderful work, some by people who have already presented this at this conference, looking at that history in a global but embracing of local specificity ways. Understanding game history as more than just a history of a media industry, but as a unique aspect of global and local technological and popular and subcultural media consumption and production, as Jose's keynote this morning showed so well, is also influenced by political, economic, and historical contexts. And so I started the LGBTQ Game Archive research in 2015, in part to begin creating a document of what LGBTQ content has looked like in games over time. It was meant to pull together all of the information and examples of LGBTQ content in digital games as a way to historicize the new content we see now. As it says on the site, this is a little A archive. It's more of a database than a capital A archive an archivist would necessarily recognize. So I'm just seeing, sorry, the chat distracted me for a second. There are archival elements though of this project that I'll discuss in a minute. And I had up until 2015 primarily focused on players and makers of games, as I assumed that at some point somebody else would of course do the obvious task of totaling up all of the LGBTQ representation in games over time. But 10 years after I started this work, no one had. And so my lesson learned number one is don't assume someone else will do the work. If you see something that needs to be done, go and do it, and really don't wait for permission to do it, within reason, of course. And as I'll talk about later, and as Anthony and Joey mentioned yesterday, there are lots of places that this research can live and make a difference. And I think that that's an important way of thinking about scholarship beyond the journal article, beyond the conference presentation. I also, at that point in my career, had wrapped up some other major projects, including my first book, and with an upcoming semester sabbatical coming up, it seemed like an approachable project to do over my sabbatical. That was very, very much not the case. And so my lesson learned number two is that documenting the history of representation in a medium that spans 30+ decades, the globe, platforms, languages, et cetera, and that occurs in implicit and explicit forms cannot be done in a single semester sabbatical. But my optimism was not wholly unfounded when I started. So drawing my inner Sophia from the Golden Girls, picture it, Philadelphia, 2007. I, as a second-year graduate student, had created a list of games with LGBTQ content as a background project where I interviewed people in or associated with the game industry about how, when, and why LGBTQ content, GLBT in the early 2000s academic parlance, did or did not get put into games. And that is that at that time, that list was only 56. And I only know that because of my somewhat snarky footnote response to an anonymous reviewer's comments. They had asked me whether there was really any evidence that LGBTQ content was rare compared to other media. So I pointed out that all of the sources available indicated there were only 56 games noted to have some form of LGBTQ content. And so, yeah, that seems lower than other media for which we have records of hundreds. But credit to that reviewer, because that means I had a number and a starting point when I returned to this list years earlier. So sometimes reviewer 2 is being helpful, even if they didn't mean to, is lesson learned number 3. Starting in spring 2015, I worked with research assistant and an independent study student to create a list of games that had been listed somewhere as having LGBTQ content. We started with lists from Wikipedia as well as other lists to compile a master list of games with LGBTQ content. The earliest example at that time was the 1980s, and so that became a starting date for the archive. That starter list was approximately 150 games. And so we broke up that list, started the work of researching each game and the claimed LGBTQ representation. We saved the images, the websites, the videos, et cetera, that talked about what that content was, where it appeared in the game, and any other information we could find. I'll show you what that process looks like in a minute. We also worked inductively to understand what the categories and types of content were, because there's no secret master list of all the LGBTQ video game characters in existence, although I am trying to get something close to that. And it's because it would be impossible to play every game in existence, just in case there was an instance, no matter how fleeting, of implicit or explicit LGBTQ content. Queer representation is also about more than just characters' identities. I wanted to include mods for reasons I think are obvious, given that some of the earlier presentations. Identifying queerly read characters was important to me because queer reading is such an important part of LGBTQ media history. One-off mentions, homophobic and transphobic jokes, references, etc., are as much a part of LGBTQ representational history as fully formed characters. And my goal here is to capture as much of that as possible. Moreover, we have many examples of characters' identities being changed through the localization process. For example, many have asserted that Birdo is the first transgender video game character, largely because when the game came to the US, the manual stated, quote, "Birdo thinks he's a girl and likes to be called Birdetta. He likes to wear a bow on his head and shoot eggs from his mouth." Later reprints omitted that description. And importantly, if you played the game without the manual, you'd never know that, and speaking to some of the earlier presentations. But what fewer people know is that a Japanese exclusive Wii game called Captain Rainbow came out many years later in the 2010s, in which a player must free Birdo after she's imprisoned for using, quote, "the wrong bathroom," as the robot jailer doesn't believe she's a woman. In that case, paratexts weren't necessary to her gender identity. Less famous than Birdo is Vivian from Paper Mario, The Thousand Years Door. She's also described as a trans woman in the Japanese version of the game, but appears to be a cis woman in the English version. Characters in the game repeatedly make fun of her for her gender, calling her a boy or a cross-dresser, whereas in the English version, those lines are altered to call her ugly instead. But in versions of the game where they just translated it from Japanese without the English localization process, they continue to make fun of her gender. And here's a video, there's no sound, of the game with the direct translation from Japanese to Spanish. As you can see, ¿y de dónde te has eso de hermanas, pero tú eres un hombre? And so, a similar example in Phantasy Star 2 features a piano teacher. It was Festa. In the Japanese version of the game, the character Rolf asked to be taught, and it's just that charges him less than any other character. And then in the Japanese version of the game, he also reportedly says of Rolf, he looks cute, but in the English version of the game, he says he looks smart. This has been read as evidence of this character being more overtly gay in the Japanese version than the English version. And since I learned yesterday that Phantasy Star is one of those games that was translated into Portuguese for Brazil, I wonder if anyone knows or can find out what he says in that version. And I'd like to follow up later. And then, so the next lesson learned for projects like this is that, and related to a conversation after one of the earlier panels, is that I think it's important to be very expansive in what counts, so as not to include interesting medium-specific possibilities of representation, particularly when games are translated into different languages and localized for different markets. We have had to and continue to have to let the categories grow even organically as the type of content representation, game mechanics, et cetera, change over time, as well as to account for how that content changes as it moves globally. And as I mentioned, I'll sort of unreveal sort of the particular methodological approach I use in this project, because I think it's one part of the project that people understand the least when looking in from the outside. Starting with that list of 151 games we created in spring 2015, I and my research assistant started going through systematically game by game, finding all that information we could, saving all the relevant files and writing up descriptions of the games, the content, and creating that classification system to code each type of content. Each game written up on the site represents between 5 and 80 hours of research. And I'll show you what that looks, and each game is its own puzzle to research. So for example, this game it came from the desert from 1989, was on the main Wikipedia list of games with LGBTQ content when we started. Searching for more mentions of the game, I came across somebody's Tumblr list of lesbians in video games. In Wikipedia, it said, in the game, the player encounters Jackie, a lesbian girl who crashed her car with her girlfriend. In the Tumblr, it says, minor character, couldn't find her name, game is set in 1951. I then looked for reviews and walkthroughs of the game to learn more. I finally found the list of characters and read through each one. Couldn't see anything about a lesbian, though I did find a character named Jackie. She did crash her car with her friend, but the woman is the girlfriend of a gangster character who she's escaping and is a potential romantic partner of the male player character in the game. Digging more, I find a long play and I watch it until I find the scene in question. All of which happened around 3 a.m. because that is the timing I was working on this project during said sabbatical. But I found it. She says, I was asleep in the back seat of the car when all of a sudden my girlfriend screams and I hear the car hit something and go off the road. I must have struck my head on the back of the seat or something, because the next thing I know, I wake up, my girlfriend's gone and the car's stuck in the sand. We've got to do something. Similarly, she says in a different emulated version that I also watched, I was involved in some trouble in Hollywood. I ran out on a guy, the kind of guy who's not used to taking no for an answer. I know too much, and if I talk, I sleep with the fishes. Out here, maybe it's rattlesnakes. So my girlfriend and I took his car, etc. And I've shown the scene to a lot of people all over the world, and there tend to be very generational and regional and linguistic divides in how people interpret this scene. But given where the game was produced, when it was set, and the narrative, it seems fairly clear to me that girlfriend here is meant in the platonic sense, where straight women call women who are their friends girlfriends, right? But because the game was on the master list of examples on Wikipedia, it had already been shared in places like Tumblr as having a lesbian character, I realized that it might actually be really important to make public these findings as I was finding them. You know, it couldn't just be work that I was doing in the background until I did whatever academic publication was coming out of it. And the scene itself isn't hugely important or historical, so maybe I would never write about it. We were finding mistakes on games that were being cited as having LGBTQ content, and we were finding more context and information about some other examples that were being widely shared but not widely understood. And so by the end of spring 2015, I decided one of the ways to organize our research as we go would be to organize it into a public-facing website. That way I could organize each game as it was being researched, as well as make the things I was finding accessible as I found them, for people who didn't have 80 hours to go down various internet rabbit holes to find information about obscure instances of representation in games from decades ago. At the time I used WordPress. I still use WordPress because it was something I was already using for teaching and for my own site. And that was a very bad idea, in large part because it means I'm paying out of pocket every year to host this site, and their infrastructure makes it really hard to change the site as our categories and ways of organizing the representation change. For instance, while we coded race of characters for one outcome research project, there's no easy way to go back into WordPress and change the organizational structure so we can include race as part of the way you search for characters in the site. It would take way too many manual labor hours to do. It also means that as WordPress updates its proprietary platform, I have no control over many of the changes, especially to the input interface. And so every time I get a new volunteer, or if I ever get a grant again, a new research assistant, I have to retrain them and myself on how to update the site. In truth, though, I don't know how I could have done it any other way, as I didn't have resources to do it any other way. I even paid out of pocket an out-of-work friend to cover some of the copy on the site. It also has proven to be a pretty impossible kind of project to find consistent funding for, because it doesn't fit within the norms of granting institutions for reasons I'll explain. It doesn't have that singular end product achievable by an end date grant. And I certainly have been able to piece together small grants to pay for research assistants, et cetera. But the ongoing project has very much been a labor of love. And, the WordPress has done its job. Nevertheless, I made the site publicly available in 2016. Since, I've had a lot of visitors. Volunteer information design expert named Shane McGarry helped me reorganize the menu structure to make it more usable in 2017. And serendipitously, Queerly Represent Me, which is a different site out of Australia, went public also in May 2016. So we launched very much in the same month. We had both been working in the backgrounds for the same amount of time. And they generated their list in categories in very different ways for me. And we had very different goals for what our two sites were. And so we collaborated and shared lists so our different sites could do what they needed for our different approaches, which is in large part how we got that initial list of 151 to quickly grow to almost 1,000. We got over 1,000 from finding games as we do the research, as well as having people let me know about more games through the comment page. Making the site public is how we learned about games that had been forgotten. For instance, I only learned about the 1996 game Fubar versus the DEA from an email submitted through the site. In Fubar versus the DEA, Fubar's boyfriend Ned had been imprisoned by the DEA's mind control camp for drug offenders. Even though Ned was caught with only a joint on him, the 21st century law clearly states that he must receive treatment. And so Fubar, it's a top-scrolling game where you're basically a little rocket ship shooting down planes and trying to collect condoms as shields. And there are lots of rainbow flags and things like that. And it's entirely designed by two people, a story which I'll explain shortly. Drawing on my Twitter network, I finally got put in touch with one of the creators who told me the story behind the creation of the game and the two other games in the series, Fubar versus the FCC and Fubar versus the school board. He and his co-creator had met in college and decided to make these games right after they finished college while they tried to figure out what to do next. His co-creator is actually the one who wanted to be the game designer and had the main idea behind the game. And he unfortunately died in a car accident on his way to California to look for a job in the game industry shortly after the game was released. And I was able to piece together information about the games from archive Wayback Machine pages and found an emulator compatible files for at least the first game. And you can find all of that on the LGBTQ Game website. Similarly, just last summer, I got an email alert that an article had been published that mentioned my archive, and it also mentioned a game I hadn't heard of, Le Crème du Parking, a French game from 1985. And once again, I went to Twitter to get more information, and someday I'll piece all of that together and it'll go up on the website. But that leads me to lesson number 7, which I didn't expect, which is that Twitter's actually very helpful in doing this kind of work. And I think we saw that in Jose's presentation, or Jose's keynote this morning. It's also how I connected with my press editor for my first book. So I owe a lot to Twitter, despite all of the badness Twitter has also brought into my life. But it has been a useful platform for this particular kind of work. As a case in point, the earliest LGBTQ indie game on record so far is Caper and the Castro from 1989. I contacted the creator in 2017 for an interview, and having just moved after retiring, they had found the original diskettes for the game. Taking to Twitter, again, I was put in touch with folks at the Strong Museum of Play who could help get the game files playable again. It was actually pretty difficult because CM had made the games using a proprietary version of HyperCard in 1989. And so Andrew Borman at the Strong had to find a 1989 era Mac to open the files using actual proprietary HyperCard software before he could image them and then save the files and make them playable via an emulator. In researching Caper and the Castro, I also happened to stumble upon a game from 1992 through my archival database research that was represented just 3 years after Caper came out as being the first LGBTQ video game, Gay Blade. I used my Twitter folks again to finally track down the creator, Ryan Best, who at the time didn't have any copies of the files anymore. But when he came to the close of the Rainbow Arcade exhibit, which I'll talk about later, he had finally found them and was able to give them to our technical designer for the exhibit from the Computerspiele Museum in Berlin, who was able to recover the files. And then thanks to Jason Scott, who I know entirely through Twitter, although we have talked on the phone, who is the founder, the person behind the Internet Archive. Both of these games are now up and playable again through the Internet Archive. But importantly, 3 of these games were only rediscovered in the time since I started working on this project. Caper and the Castro was only rediscovered the year before I started this project via 2014 interview with Paste. And except for the French game, all were made by people who made those games and nothing else for a variety of reasons. So all 4 games were largely lost for nearly 30 years and then only recently rediscovered, which leads to my next lesson learned, which is that we're always rediscovering history, particularly when we're talking about gaming histories that happen outside spaces of traditional cultural preservation, popular representation, and respectability. We are reliant, as many people have spoken out throughout this conference, on fan collectors, our own archives to recreate these undocumented stories. And sometimes, as again, Jose wonderfully showed this morning, we can also use those to understand absences in that history. The other major lesson, though, is that we're also losing digital history. These rediscovered examples point to a much bigger history of at least game content that has simply been lost to time. I suspect there were more indie one-off games from LGBTQ plus designers in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that we just don't have access to. And that's exacerbated by the digital nature of the medium, as Caper and the Castro shows. In some cases, the formats were tied to proprietary software and hardware, and that has been created primarily to ensure intellectual property rights rather than historical records of media content are preserved. And beyond the games themselves, the records created by fans and communities around these games are so easily and quickly lost. As a case in point, gaygamer.net went offline and was not archived shortly before the LGBTQ game archive went public. And that site was a major source of our game archive research in that first year, as the site and the forums actively documented this content as it came out, as well as historical examples. And while some of those communities have migrated to other platforms, the information, the records, the archiving of it hasn't. And so lesson number 9 is that we've already lost a great deal of digital gaming history. And as many people at this conference have demonstrated, recovering that history can be a fraught process. And so one additional output of this project that I think not as many people know about is that in collaboration with a few different entities, I donated tens of thousands of digital files saved over the course of this project and donated by collaborator Joshua Savage to the Strong Museum of Play in Rochester, New York, in the hopes that regardless of what happens to various sites we got information from, future researchers will be able to go to see those original images, videos, and texts that we had to work with in creating the site. You do have to go to the Strong to access the files, but there is an Omeka site that you can search to see what's there. And then, as Nick has mentioned, one of the biggest culminating projects to date out of all of this work was Rainbow Arcade, the exhibition I co-curated for the Schulz Museum in Berlin. The exhibit ran from December 2018 to May 2019. We are very lucky because 1 year later would have not been ideal for having an international exhibit with lots of people flying in and out of Berlin. It was the culmination of both the LGBTQ game archive research, as well as nearly 15 years of my own research, and also sort of its own case study in making queer game history accessible to an international audiences. Many people traveled to the exhibit from all over the world who may be unfamiliar with games or unfamiliar with LGBTQ history. From the first section, we wanted people to question what they think they know about game history and trouble that idea first, given the fact that we are constantly, even today, still rediscovering that history. We also wanted them to question who they think makes games and easy assumptions about what the mainstream game industry represents. So in the mainstream gaming section, we showed that LGBTQ plus people have been a part of the game industry since the game industry has been in existence. We also, in the next section, wanted to expand their views of what indie games are. We had games and game designers from North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australia all represented in the exhibition. We also gave equal spaces to communities around games and their own production practices, as well as highlight that lost recent history. And we didn't shy away from discussing the bad side of gaming, but we did design the physical space so that they could go around it if they wanted to. There was a warning sign before you entered that part of the exhibit. And we also used that space to highlight the absences produced by hate. Those people who left gaming and the game industry were highlighted in that section, not as people, but as a giant blank wall. And that section also included a series of video games we made in collaboration with Feminist Frequency. And at the end of the exhibit, in our next level section, we sort of push back on easy assumptions about what the future of games might look like, and offer a wide array of kinds of games, from visual novels to board games to ones built to be played with early NES controllers, because we can't begin to imagine a better future for games if that future only presumes one vision of progress, just as we can't have a real history of video games if we only imagine one version of that history being legitimate. And so Rainbow Arcade was my CV and an attempt to translate a decade and a half of work for many publics. I've presented elements of that work quite a bit, both before and after that exhibit. There have been a great deal of press coverage of the work as well, especially during and after that exhibit. And the video series, made in collaboration with Feminist Frequency, funded by a Canadian SSHRC grant, and the exhibit grant was written by my former RA, Chris Prasad, which added another layer of publicness to the information, as those videos are still online, available online. And in addition to being just a very public representation of my own scholarship, it was made possible through the publicness of the LGBTQ Game Archive database. That is, the success of the Kickstarter for the museum exhibit catalog was directly tied to the existing audience of my own work and the archive's social media accounts and followings, the excitement people had years leading into this. And in fact, the existence of the exhibit itself is because of the archive. So they decided they wanted to do an exhibit on gaming. They saw the archive and invited me to be part of it. And people have asked me if the exhibit is ever going to travel or if the catalog will ever go back into print. And to that, I can only advise that anyone doing similar projects be sure to secure contracts and intellectual property agreements around the afterlife of projects in advance, particularly when funding comes from multiple places. But for the rest of my work, I've been proactively attempting to make the research produced from the archive publicly and open access available within the bounds of my own resources and the professional needs of any co-authors. And if anything is not accessible to you, I will send it to you. Just send me an email. And the site itself, of course, continues to be a public resource. As of Thursday, since May 2016, their site has received 1.4 million views. And the publicness of the research is one of the many things I'm most proud of about this work, but it's also the thing that has made the work so much better, because people can send in corrections, because people can build on it. And so you might ask yourself, are we done? I ask myself that all the time. That is a lot of work to have done over 7 years, and surely it must be time to move on to the next thing. But in truth, this is work that just generates more work. Every year of work that has gone into the project has seen as many or more games added to the master list as are completely researched and added to the site. Since we hit the 1/3 mark of the master list being complete in late 2016, we have stayed there, because even as the work gets done, we find more games are created, more games are uncovered, more games are discovered. And this is a project that doesn't end. I never know if this will work, because it's very generationally specific, whether or not anybody knows who Lamb Chop is. So I also include the Sisyphus of the rainbow ball scrolling. But I've learned to accept that this project being a project that doesn't end isn't a bad thing. Finding more history, finding more games can only be a good thing. That said, that it is a lot of work. And as I mentioned, it's not easily funded types of work. This work requires a lot of ongoing publicness rather than end products that typically grant-funded research projects entail. And I'll be honest, most of these tasks have been rather beyond me while managing teaching and service obligations during an ongoing global pandemic. In particular, I've pretty much given up on deciding whether or not new accounts following the archive are troll bots or tweens with new accounts, but that also means I have to be much more selective about what I retweet. from that account. For instance, last spring, I retweeted one of our graduate students' invitations for trans players to be part of their research project, and they got flooded with bot responses and had to shut the survey down and dig through a bunch of messed up data because somebody decided to harass them because the LGBTQ Game Archive account had retweeted them. And so they were still able to solve it. They had already still had a critical mass of people who had responded who were real and actually wanted to talk. But it is something that I have to be more careful and attentive to moving forward. And so for all the great outcomes, publicness itself can be a limitation. And the expectation of responsiveness in particular, because as I have a full-time job that is not this, responding to every single request for an edit, the ongoing list for edits is thousands of miles long at this point. But the expectation that there be a faster response is something I've had to manage over the years through language on the site and through email automatic replies. But then again, publicness is also means that more people can contribute to the knowledge making. I very openly share the underlying Excel sheet that is not what's on the website for people wanting to do their own analyses and then feature their work on the website if they want to later. For instance, I shared visualizations from a Brazilian indie game company called Fecha, who asked to do an analysis very early on in the project. I've also partnered with researchers like Coco Major, and who along with Xavier Ho in Australia, I'm partnering with to do some updated visualizations. I've also consulted with and shared info with consultants and marketers over the years, and that the project itself has generated awareness enough of LGBTQ game content that more people are doing work related to it. And so my final lesson learned, and I think this speaks to a point Nick has made earlier, and I think people have already demonstrated throughout this wonderful conference, is that sharing is caring. And I think that it is really important in doing work like this to be very open about sharing resources in this way. There is so much more to write about the LGBTQ Game Archive than I could ever manage in my own lifetime. And ethically speaking, the bulk of the research possible in this archive is possible because of the labors of fans who create wikis, upload long play videos, share screen grabs, and talk about the LGBTQ content they see in games. People helped kickstart the Rainbow Arcade catalog. People have voluntarily written entries and supported this work in myriad ways. And so it is important and ethical to make this work public as it goes on. And so my final thought, having heard everyone's work so far, is that part of reclaiming game histories requires working together. I usually end by saying LGBTQ people have always been part of game history, but I'd add to that, as we've seen this weekend, Hispanic and Latin American folks have as well. So have LGBTQ plus Hispanic and Latin American folks, and I would guarantee, and so have people from all regions of the world in various ways. These stories are not peripheral to mainstream gaming history, they are gaming history. And with our various resources, we can do so much more to document these histories and work together. And I hope we find an opportunity to do so moving forward. Thank you. And I'm going to apologize. I know I talk very fast. And so if I need to go back to any slide, I will gladly go back to any slide.
No
I talk
worries.
even faster via Zoom. I don't know what it is.
Thank you for that. I was really happy to see how much those lessons almost serve as sort of de facto meta lessons for this work, right? And of course, there are nuances that are critical between the different artifacts, but broadly speaking, it was nice to see this exactly what I was expecting to see. Like, people in the chat were already talking about some of the lessons they can take from your work as they try to go into archiving and saving this space. As we've seen throughout the last couple of days, and especially today, there have been some anxieties around losing the content, right? And that's something that I think does get talked about sort of on the fringes and certainly in academic events, but it's a nice reminder that, you know, we can't start quickly enough. And I think, Adrienne, what you've shown us is you probably could never overestimate the amount of work that is involved in something like this. You know, I especially think about when Phil and Jose were talking earlier today, and others as well. I think Mariano just, we're lucky because she has her own personal archive. Like, same with Jose. Like, well, I just happen to have my stack of 80, Chilean era disc, and that's how we're going to make this happen. So there's an interesting intersection of the fans as the archivists and the scholars as the archivists. And sometimes we forget that we serve as both and also as the archivists, and also maybe have the voices that we're able to contribute to these projects. And I think we can all respect the unwritten labor that goes into this work. I can tell you personally, it's what drew me to it. When I first saw that launch, I guess I thought about, and maybe other folks here have this who are game collectors, just our little curations, the amount of work we put into those, right? I found a copy of EVO once in a bookstore. I thought it was the end of the world. And then to see your team's work and how expansive that was. So I don't mean to shower with undue praise, but I think it's due praise. And I appreciate you sharing that with us today. As I go through, it's interesting. I didn't see a lot of comments or questions for Adrienne so much as just a lot of this, wow, that, yes, this, we should do what she's talking about. But I did want to keep the mics open for folks who did want to ask some questions with time we have remaining. We do have about 20 minutes on the schedule. So I'm going to go and hand it over. I will keep monitoring the chat, but if folks want to jump in, I think we've established a pretty good culture at this point that you should feel free to unmic, speak up, and I will double check the chat for any gems that may have gotten missed.
I guess if I may, I'll start out. Adrienne, thanks so much for a fascinating presentation. I see, so many implications and so much that we can learn from this, and looking at the relationship between video games and Latin American and Latinx culture. And I just wondered if you could articulate that a bit, because I know that you have also done regional game studies. I've read your work on Indian game development. And as someone who's worked on kind of regional or national issues in games, and who's also worked on gender and sexual identity, what are the points of contact? What do you think are the things that you do the same in both fields, and where does it differ?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that my work in, say, doing work in India, or I previously had done work in Finland, I did work on games in the Middle East. And one of the things that made me attentive to is seeing, to a point that I think was made during an earlier panel, is seeing where you can see influence of authorship, even in games that are produced by transnational companies. And so I remember, for example, I was talking to a game designer in Finland on one project, and I was like, but how do you see Finnishness being represented in this game that you're making that is not about Finland? And one of the things he said was like, well, you can tell, like, driving through the forest, it's just so Finnish. Like, this forest that we put into Forza is so Finnish. And it's something that I wouldn't have seen, right? And it's something that, a lot of the games, games are being produced all over the world, regardless of what the content of the game is about. And I think being able to parse that and getting to that question of authorship, in the mainstream industry section of Rainbow Arcade, one of the things we pointed out is that a lot of people in the game industry are LGBTQ plus who don't necessarily make games about that. And so where do we talk about the importance of representation of somebody like someone like Danny Button, who didn't come out until after most of her work had been published in the video game industry. And actually Whitney Powell's doing some great work recovering the transness of Danny Button's work. And I think that's Gordon Bellamy was a driving force in the Madden series for many, many years. He's also been the person bringing together LGBTQ community, professional communities in the game industry. And so I think that they're finding ways to talk about representation beyond just what ends up in the game, I think, is one point of contact. I think the other is also understanding our idea of temporality in games is not consistently useful. If we're talking about people who made games in the 1980s, most game history only follows the history of those people if they stay, right? If they stay in those industries. And as I said, a lot of the people made one-off games and they weren't even in the game industry. They made a thing in their bedroom and then they disappeared. And like, there are cultures of that happening where people made one-off games, but they didn't go on. They didn't go on to be part of the game industry. And I think that that's a regional history that hasn't been well documented. Even, I mean, in India is the example I can think of, where I know that there were a lot of people making and playing games. I also know that a lot of people were playing games that were like 20 years old, and that just happened to be the games that everyone had, that was free and pirated and everyone shared. But how do we talk about that in game studies if we're so focused on what people are playing on now? That's sort of a meandering way of answering your question. There are too many things to talk about.
No, that's very much answering it. Yeah, and it's so much of it's evident in, for example, in the way you organize the exhibition. It's like all of these aspects could be examined vis-a-vis Latin American and Latinx culture as well. Thank you so much.
I'd like to just piggyback a little bit on that question. One, I was really excited about the presentation about Rainbow Arcade, but one past inspiration in your work, Adrienne, for me has been your method of using interviews. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
In what sense? I'm sorry.
Just because we're an interdisciplinary group here, what methodological approach do you take towards interviewing game developers?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I've done interviews with game developers as well as game players, and I think one of the things I find interesting in doing, especially as to Phil's question, doing global game research, is trying to talk to them past the kind of information that ends up in newspaper articles. So as one example, I was interviewing a game designer in the Middle East about a game that was supposedly a response to Arab depictions in video games. But when I finally got a chance to interview and talk it to him, one of the things that I would ask questions about is well, people are saying, this is how people have been talking about the game. Can you tell me more about that, your perspective on that? And one of the things he said immediately is, that's just the story they want to tell. And then he told me a very different counter narrative about the impetus behind his game and the reason he made the games the way he did. And I think that that's one of the things that I appreciate about doing the interview process, is because we can talk about the surface level things that most people would ask, but it allows a back and forth conversation where I can sort of give them a chance to answer the questions they don't usually get asked about the things that they're making. And so one of the things I discovered when I was in India is that I was invited to go to a giant gaming conference, and as I was trying to interview people, they kept asking me questions because I was the expert from America. And I was like, I am recently graduated PhD student. I don't know anything, but I could learn what they thought was important and what they wanted to say by what they were asking me. And so it was a chance to sort of turn it around a little bit, to be like, what about the game industry? What expectations do you have about what the game industry in the US looks like versus what the game industry in India looks like? And where do you see the place of the Indian gaming industry vis-a-vis the global gaming industry, in large part in the way that they were asking me questions, like what they wanted to see. And I think that when it comes to talking to game designers about LGBTQ content in that earlier project, one of the things that was a little harder to do was get people to open up about things that they might not feel comfortable about, the proprietariness of the conversations we were having about games that they had worked on, but making it, very clear that this is an academic interview versus a journalistic interview is one way that really gets them to open up and tell those stories about how things go down, like how things actually happen, versus how, what you're supposed to say at GDC is how things happen versus like what the conversation in the room actually entailed. And I think that that's, in terms of a methodological approach, interviews are very good at getting deeper than what people might tell you the first time you talk to them. And the final thing I'll say is that when it comes to interviewing players, one of the things I did for Gaming at the Edge is I interviewed them, and then I went back and interviewed them while they were playing video games, and it resulted in very different answers. And not different answers, but different interactions. So one of my favorites was one person who, gave me very short taciturn answers in our first interview. Second interview, he talked for 2 hours straight while playing Diablo 2. I didn't even have to ask questions. He just remembered all of my questions and started answering them again. But I didn't have to say anything. He just kept talking. And I think that that's one of the things that is also hard, because that, there's a lot of data there, but it's also how you get different layers of things. I haven't done much interview related to the game archive work, but for the Rainbow Arcade, we did create like sort of lists of questions to ask all of the people who were part of it, so that we could display their answers throughout the exhibit. And so in the last section, one of my favorites was we asked everybody, indie mainstream industry community member who was represented in the exhibit, to say why they still stay with games, if they do, and where they see the future of gaming. And so we could put all of those answers up on a wall, because it was so many different perspectives. And I think that hearing the stories of people is something that I personally find very valuable. I'm not sure if that fully answered your question, but.
Completely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to have Mar come in now. And then after Mar, I'm going to have Jose come in. Okay, Mar, go ahead.
Thank you, Nick. Dr. Shaw, thank you, first of all, for coming to this conference and for your talk. And I would like to know which were the most interesting patterns that you found during your research? What are the most interesting things that repeat that you found that you weren't expecting and that just turned up during the archive?
I mean, I think, so one of the most interesting things is that the two game series that had by far the most LGBTQ content in them were Grand Theft Auto and Leisure Suit Larry. I've written about both of those series, and in context, it made sense, but I was surprised. Especially when it comes to Grand Theft Auto, because Grand Theft Auto has the most racial, class, and gender diversity of LGBTQ representation of any other video game series, compared to all of these other companies that have, well-crafted, nuanced, we worked with consultants, we gave the voice actor input on the character, but you get one. And then you go to GTA and it's purposely meant to be offensive, but you get so much diversity. And so I think that one is, and I've presented on this before, is I think I would like people who are trying to do representation better to learn something from people who are not at all trying to do representation better, because somehow they manage to realize that there can be a world of people who are queer and not just one really good character who's put in a great narrative, but they're all by themselves. I would say the other thing is that we're seeing more and more representation of LGBTQ characters as playable characters, especially in action and narrative-based games. But if you look at the 80s and 90s, where we see the most playable LGBTQ characters are fighting games, right? Are like, they're one-off characters. Some of it's more implicit than not, but I thought it wasn't what I expected, because since especially the 2000s, we're so used to seeing those characters in RPGs or in as I said, action and narrative-based games, that I wasn't expecting so much in the fighting game area. And I think it's because they have casts of characters, and so one of the characters gets to be, that one-off, somewhat effeminate male character like Rasputin from World Heroes, who pulls male characters into rose bushes and then hearts emanate from them as one of his fighting moves, right? And as Regina said in the chat, that's also true for Latinx characters, right? Like if you have a cast of characters, people can imagine making a lot of diversity, but if you have one-off characters, it appears to be much harder to imagine that we can have more diversity. I think those would be my two. And I think the third is that you might have noticed if you visited the site that there's no representation of World of Warcraft, and that is because nobody has written or added World of Warcraft to any of the lists we started with of having substantial LGBTQ representation. Similarly, nobody has added to the list games that feature athletes who have since come out as gay. But they exist, they're represented in the games. People have volunteered before to make that list for me and nobody has. So if that is of interest to anybody here, I desperately need that list of games with athletes who eventually came out. But that is, I think that the absences are the things that interest me the most. And the last thing I'll say, and this is actually something Jose's talk made me think of, one of the biggest absences I've noticed, and and Chris and then my colleague Bo Ruberg have written about this before as well, is the absence of AIDS narratives in the 80s and 90s. If you look at any other media representing especially gay men and bisexual men in the 80s and 90s, AIDS was the storyline for 2 decades. And it just doesn't make an appearance in games. There's, Caper and the Castro was released as charityware, and they asked that you donate to the AIDS charity of your choice if you downloaded it. But everywhere else in the games, even as that metaphoric reference, it's just not there. And I find that particularly interesting. And I have lots of theories on why. None are satisfying, but I also wonder if a lot of those games were indie games that were lost, were one-off games that people made and then disappeared. I have other theories, but those are the main trends. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Shaw. That was really interesting.
Jose has a question now. Thank you for that.
Adrienne, thanks for your talk. Really interesting. Really appreciate a lot of the things that you've done and what you put in. So, kudos. I'm just going to read the question that I typed in the chat, which is, what is it like to have to manage both your professional / academic persona with your role as the head of a project that has so much well-earned praise and attention? It's sort of very public-facing project. So I'm just curious of how you sort of managed that and dealt with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of it is poor work-life balance.
Oh, no.
No, I mean, I'm not, it is a lot of work. And I will say that one of the things is that, it has, I think, made me more careful about the projects I agree to be part of. So I am pretty singularly focused on the archive at this stage. And that is because it takes so much work to just keep it going. I think it's also, it is my professional persona. Like, it is my teaching persona. It is also something I cover in classes. It's something related to a lot of the work I do. And so I don't treat them as separate. I will say that I do have to be like, when my university wants me to talk to journalists about anything related to tech, I have to be like, no, because I'm talking to all of the journalists who want to talk to me about LGBTQ Game Archive and Rainbow Arcade. And so that's the thing I'm going to talk about. I will also say that, that I would recommend that none of you ever try to run a Kickstarter during the start of fall semester. I wasn't supposed to run the Kickstarter, but the person on the Rainbow Arcade team who was supposed to run the Kickstarter was in a bike accident and broke both of his wrists the day we launched the Kickstarter. I will say that a lot of it is using, timed tweets and tricks and loading things up into summer and breaks. I don't think I have a satisfying answer for you, Jose, because it is a lot of work and I am very behind on updating the site. If I had, if I had all the money in the world, I would hire somebody to manage it, to keep it going, because I think a lot of progress on it has stalled, especially the last 2 years with, teaching during a global pandemic is a lot of work, as I think many of you have experienced. And so it is a slower to update project and site for all of the reasons that you would expect. And I think that there's not, I don't know if I have a satisfying answer for you. I don't know how I do it. I'm also trying to buy a house right now in this market. So I
feel your pain.
I don't know.
Well, thank you. I have a follow-up if I'm allowed, Nick.
Yeah, please.
Has there been any interest from sort of LGBTQ organizations, associations outside of sort of the academic circles and basically saying, yes, we would love to take this on, and we have a foundation that can provide some money or some staff support and that?
I mean, that's a problem. I am a member of GLAAD's Gaming Advisory Council as of last fall, and we've talked to them about that before, but GLAAD, you might not realize this from the outside, but GLAAD only has a staff of 8 people doing all of their work. And most of them, the one person doing gaming, that's not her entire job. And so I think part of it is that we are, and I think we're also working with the organizations who would provide the most, who have the greatest connection are also the ones that tend to not have a ton of money related to it. And so I saw somewhere in the chat, I think Nick posted something about the NIH. I talked to a person at the NIH and they very specifically said that because the website exists and because there's no end date, it's not the kind of project that they do, right? They want things that are fit
Wow.
in a thing that will finish, you know.
The
So it's
irony that you started and therefore they can't help a started project.
yes.
Wow. Okay.
And also to, like, you know, one of the main things I want to get funding for is to move it off of WordPress because to a bespoke site because of all the limitations I discussed. And so finding money to move something that exists to a better place for it to exist is not something that granting agencies are particularly interested in. They want a brand new thing that they can claim that they funded fully, I think is part of it. But, you know, versus it's also funny because in Berlin, you know, I didn't realize until I got to Berlin on the ground when we were doing the work, just how hard it was to get anyone to treat games as a serious area of study, because coming from the US, we just do. And that had been my experience. Like, I mean, not when I started grad school, but by that point in my career, I assumed that was pretty cut and dry. But we had gone up for a bigger grant to fund the exhibit and lost out to a similar exhibit, but it was about opera because they didn't understand what games had to do with German history. You know, and I think that I've known several collaborators in European countries who've run into similar problems trying to do archival projects or cultural heritage projects where the nation state doesn't see games as part of their cultural heritage. And I think that that's something that I see nodding. I think that's a problem that a lot of people run into, is seeing games as a cultural heritage thing, especially if you're trying to talk about games globally, and trying to document games globally as part of cultural heritage.
You know, that point again, it's frustrating but enlightening to see it. It came up several times over the last 2 days that, you know, we forget that the public perception of these things, and maybe even the historical perception of these things, is they're somebody else's, whether it was they're for kids or they're somebody else's culture or they're somebody else's artifact. And that last one's so frustrating to me because for those of us who have been to that museum in Berlin, you know, they have a whole exhibit on the DDR's history with gaming as part of their engineering efforts. And it's a lesson that I think I'll take away from the symposium as I think about whether it's as dramatic as the moral panic perspective or just something as unfortunately mundane as just deleting a part of history that doesn't seem interesting, right? It's just games. Why would we care about this? Thank you.
I mean, I've seen, because, you know, I've talked to people about this before because I also know a lot of people trying to save early, like 90s and early 2000s queer digital spaces and community groups and Yahoo groups and things like that, and finding people who see that as part of history is remarkably hard in these funding agencies because it's too new to be history. But anybody involved in these spheres knows that we're rapidly losing it because there's no money to preserve it. So it is easier for me to find out about 1970s Spock Kirk shipping fan fiction zines and the communities that shared them than it is to figure out what people in 1999 thought about a game. Because all of those websites are gone, because a lot of those forums are gone, because the places they shared those things are gone. And that's something that, you know, I know a lot of people working on it, but it becomes frustrating because we lived through it. So there has to be a way to capture it. I know a lot of people have been contemplating doing oral histories of early web culture since all of that information is so hard to find. But aside from the Wayback Machine, there haven't been a lot of ways to recover that information.
This point's critical. I mean, we've seen it affect so many of the presentations and panels today and yesterday, right? I just shared a link to Judah Molloy's book on social media archaeology and poetics, where she attempted to try to gather those oral histories. And one of the neat things about her volume is she had essays written by those people. And so it was intentionally, I wouldn't say non-academic, that would be disparaging of the book, but she looked for those people to tell their experience with the Berkeley Community Project and things like that. And, you know, your point about missing our growth is so frustrating, right? We can find books that are 50 years old and we can find books from yesterday, but finding things from the 80s, early 90s, and it sounds like we're all sharing that on this chat. You know, even in areas where we maybe didn't have some of the same socio-cultural strife, we still cannot find the history. So even in a setup area. So thank you for that, sincerely. folks, we're right at time. I've never been at a conference that went on schedule, by the way. I don't think. So I'll take 2 minutes and put them in the bank. I'm going to pass it to Kent to sort of close us out. And I just want to again express my appreciation